There we go. That better? Perfect. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second Directors Workshop of 2024. First of all, just like to say thank you for attending today. I really hope you enjoy this more interactive experience to your studies. Now, today, our guest lecturer is Professor Steve Ross-Talbot, who is a Professor of Distributed Computing at Kingston University in London. He is also an author of the SOA Manifesto and a former chair of all the web services standards in W3C. He is a long-time chief technology officer across various companies from software product makers to solution providers. Today, Steve is building a virtual power plant at Electric Miles to help achieve self-sovereign energy as a contribution to achieving a sustainable future for the planet. In today's workshop, we'll be looking into evolution of distributed ledger technology, also known as blockchain. I won't go into any more detail because I know Steve will be talking about it over the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. But before I pass you over to him, please do ensure that you stay muted until the Q&A session at the end, unless we've got any interactive questions throughout. And that's everything from me. So without further ado, over to our guest lecturer today, Professor Steve Ross-Talbot.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I wish I'd given you a shorter introduction now. Do you want me to share the screen now?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, so I shall share my desktop. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So
yeah, that's great.
Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me. Commensurate with the brief that I was given, what I was asked to do was to present some kind of industry that needs transformational change and explain how technology can affect that change and perhaps affect it in more ways than they think. And with that in mind, given that I'm building a virtual power plant, sustainability in the energy ecosystem seems to be a really good place to look for as an exemplar of an industry that needs that change. And so this in large part is a story of change and technology transformation, which we are undergoing at this very moment. So it's in play right now. And it's been in play in truth for the last 5 years, but technology takes some time to catch up. So the outline of the talk really is the exemplar of the industry, the energy ecosystem, and its need for net zero, and technology enablement, in this case, blockchain, which is the technology enabler for this. And the way that we might look at this is the ecosystem has a bunch of challenges, and the technology enablement is there hopefully to meet those challenges. Now, it's not always technology. There are some economic and social and organizational challenges along the way. And I will mention some of those as we go. And the relevance is all about the relevance to you as students. So I hope I'm going to make this relevant to you in two ways. One as an exemplar, and the other is that there's a real need for business thinkers to engage with this blockchain technology, and I'll explain the role that I think people like you might play in the future. So the emerging energy ecosystem needed for net zero, it's dominated by this pledge of net zero throughout, and there's macro challenges and there's micro challenges in achieving the aims of net zero from the government perspective, but equally from our own perspective as individuals who consume and in some cases might supply energy to the grid. So the macro problems facing the ecosystem today is the growth in chargers. I don't know if any of you ever remember, people used to joke that when England was playing a significant football match, at half time, all the kettles went on, and that would cause a drain on the grid. Well, a kettle's quite small compared to an EV charger. So the more electric cars we have, the more stress there will be on the grid, because the more chargers we will need. And the grid needs to balance that in some way. And the current infrastructure isn't really good enough. And commensurate with that, those demand spikes are going to require a 6 billion upgrade to the national grid. And that's going to result in some pressure on consumer prices alone. And that's just from the grid, not from the DSOs who supply electricity to your homes and your offices. And with a 30% CO2 increase at stake, if the demand spikes aren't smoothed, it has a major impact on our ability to meet net zero in and of itself. And finally, the other challenge is, I don't know if you know how your energy is priced, but it uses a technique called marginal cost pricing. You can think of it as a pie chart with all of the sources of energy and the price against each of those sources. And then you pick the one that's highest, which just doesn't seem particularly fair. And that really accounts for the massive changes in pricing as the most expensive element, which was gas and oil, skyrocketed at the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict. The micro problems are really those sort of faced by consumers. So on the one hand, I can't easily say, I just want to use sustainable energy in my place of where I live. And neither can I easily sell it back to the grid. It's quite a challenge to do that. It's possible, but it's a challenge, and you really have to want to do it. So they're not making it easy. Equally, individuals don't have the time to manage their energy assets. So I'll give you an example. Octopus Energy announced last year that they were going to do this demand side flexibility thing. They sent out emails to people to participate. Some people wrote back and said, yes, we'll participate. And what they were asked to do was on a particular day, between a particular time frame, they needed to make sure they turned things off. Now, I don't know about you, but most people I know wouldn't be going around the house doing that because Octopus Energy asked. And indeed, whilst it was deemed a success, the fallout rate was really quite large. So it's clear that it's a challenge to get people to change their behavior and turn things off when you want them to. And many assets, people that have static batteries or people that have EVs or people that have solar could supply energy. But the bar to entry to supply on a proper basis remains very high. And there are penalties if you can't meet that supply. And finally, I think the grid and the DSOs, the DSOs being the distributed service operators, they're the people like Scottish Power and UK Power Networks. These are the DSOs. These are the people that manage your segments of the grid. And the grid is like the telephone wires right up and down the country. And the DSOs manage regions. And the DSOs are where you get your bills from. Nobody trusts either of them these days, especially because they've made insane profits. So these are some of the problems faced by the ecosystem. If we sort of track back and think, well, what does energy look like today? You know, we've got a planet that's a little bit concerning. So that's hence the planet icon in the top right. And you've got a range of energy sources towards the top. There's oil, there's coal, there's gas, there's nuclear, there's water, wind, solar, and wave technology. So there's a range of sources, and the grid asks the DSOs to go purchase that. They go to the marketplace in the top left, and then the grid's responsible for balancing the supply and the demand in the different regions that's consumed by the houses, the hospitals, the offices, and the factories. And this is how our ecosystem sort of looks. So nuclear is a reasonably big thing. Oil, coal, and gas is a much bigger thing, and the others are quite small. And where we want to go to is we want to change that. So we want to get rid of the oil, coal, and gas, and we want to increase our use of more sustainable forms of energy. And that will require us to leverage the energy assets of all those houses, what's on the hospitals, what's on the offices, what's on the factories, because all of them can have solar, some of them can have wind, some of them will have EVs, which can discharge electricity when you're not using your car. Some of them will have air source, ground source heat pumps that can be turned on and off, and so on and so forth. And that requires more localized balancing, not the balancing that comes from on high from the grid. So these are challenges for the future. So when we look at the challenges to the ecosystem, if I was summarizing it, one of those challenges which derives from the micro problems is customer choice. I simply can't choose what I want to. And I'm happy for things to be done and managed for me. I want a degree of automation, but I ultimately want to decide. So I want to press the go button. But I'm happy for things to be set up so that then I don't miss the Octopus Energy opportunity. And lowering the barrier to participation, making it easy for people to either consume energy locally, peer-to-peer, or supply energy locally to their peers. Trust in a trustless world. How do we get that trust back? There's been many instances of price hiking and all the rest of it. So how can we be sure in a to have trust in a trustless world? Then there's the flexibility of supply and demand. How do we balance those spikes? And the value for money pricing, given that we've got marginal cost pricing today. So if these are the biggest challenges, if I was summarizing all those challenges, these are the biggest challenges. What are the requirements on the technology? What do we want the technology to do that can help us here? And making sure that the network's secure. The last thing you want when you're rebuilding the grid is to open up attack vectors for nefarious actors to go and do things to the grid that you don't want them to do. So securing the network's really quite paramount. And at the moment, everyone's quite worried about that as they're going on. So how do we do that? Well, the sort of technologies that we want are ones that can promote self-sovereignty. If we've got self-sovereignty, then we're in charge. We want technologies that can be transparent without compromising that self-sovereignty. So you want to make sure that if you're supplied or you've turned something down, that you truly get paid for it. And it's transparent in terms of what you did, and it's transparent in terms of what you're now owed in terms of money or tokens in this case for doing so. Ensuring that the equipment that you have when you're supplying power to the grid is properly audited and maintained. This is one of the barriers to entry. The trust in a trustless world, well, this is kind of what blockchains do with cryptography and immutability. The fact that stuff on a blockchain is immutable is quite an important property because you can guarantee that there's no fraudulent activity with that piece of data. Nobody has overwritten it because that's not possible to do. The flexibility of supply and demand requires constraint solving so that the system can attenuate my assets as a domestic owner based upon the need to lower demand or increase supply if I'm a supplier too. The value for money pricing, removing the intermediaries becomes a really important part here. If you can remove the intermediaries, you can take control of the pricing, and the pricing becomes more localized as a result. And then securing the network. Well, the one thing that we know about blockchains is that they are secure, they are available, and in some cases they scale. But we'll see that as we go. So those are the kind of requirements that we have to meet technically. And what I wanted to do was talk about how blockchains meet that, but not from a really technical perspective, but I want to sort of imbue it with a few observations and anecdotes. So how does a blockchain meet those challenges? Well, the first thing to do is we better tell you what a blockchain is. You might not know. So a blockchain, it's a chain of blocks with data inside, and the data inside those blocks is immutable. So because it's a chain that happens over time, it becomes an immutable provenance of data. So as data is modified, the old version still stays there, and the new version's on a block further along the chain. So you can actually use it to ensure that you have full provenance of a piece of data. And it was developed in really 1991, well before Nakamoto's famous paper. And it was developed to do things like timestamping. So this notion of distributed ledger was there from 1991 onwards. Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009 is the person who nobody knows who he is, of course, who gave rise to what we now consider a blockchain. So what he added to the distributed ledger was this notion of mining and the ability to have an algorithmic consensus. And that blockchain is what was used to launch Bitcoin. So that first blockchain that was done, and that gave rise to the local sort of knowledge that people now have about cryptocurrency and blockchain, thinking that they're both the same, but they're not really. So blockchains can be used for all manner of things. There are all sorts of applications out there, from private markets, debt, IP identity, ownership, and so on. The ones that we're really interested in to deal with the problems of our energy ecosystems are these ones. So we want microfinance so that as you start to supply or attenuate your demand, you get paid in a really quick way without an intermediary. Supply chain, because ultimately, if you're attenuating both demand and providing supply, you're in an energy supply chain. Ownership, because you own the assets. And identity, because it's you that owns the assets. It's you that should get the money when your assets actually participate in the grid, in the supply or the demand of electricity. So these are the sorts of areas that traditionally blockchains are quite good at, but there are problems with them, which we will see as we go along. So first of all, not all blockchains are created equal. There's a whole bunch of different ones. So we can look at distributed ledger technology as a whole, and we can start dividing it. So there's the notion of the public blockchain. This is what Bitcoin runs on. So Bitcoin, we might consider it as blockchain 1.0. And then there's Ethereum, which is a bit more modern. It has this notion of a smart contract, which we'll come to. And we might consider that as blockchain 2.0. And that's quite popular. So Bitcoin and Ethereum, the dominant players in the blockchain world. There's federated blockchains because a lot of companies wanted to get into this stuff. So there's distributed ledger federated blockchain technology from IBM, and equally there's blockchains like R3. And those are federated. And that's because they don't need a algorithmic consensus. They actually have consensus based upon what you might call a notary. So there's a third party involved within the federation. So it's not a true blockchain. And then there's 3.0 blockchains, which are all based on something called proof of stake, which we'll have a look at briefly. Whereas Ethereum and Bitcoin, at least Ethereum in the past, was all proof of work. And these terms, proof of work and proof of stake, I'll explain as I go, because they become quite important. They actually impact the tokenomics, which is where I want to get to. So if you look at the anatomy of a blockchain, it's a set of blocks that get built up over time. Those blocks have a smart contract that mediates what goes on and off the block. Even really Bitcoin has this, but the smart contracting language for Bitcoin is very, very tiny, whereas the smart contracting language for Ethereum is quite large, so you can do many more things. And effectively what happens in a block is the block's just recording, on a basic level, it's recording data. In this case, I've said it's amounts. So it's like transactions like you'd see in a bank or, like you'd see with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin really just does this. Its smart contracts only know about these sorts of things, which is who the money's to, who the money's from, how much is it, and what's your balance. And that's all that Bitcoin smart contracts know about. And those mediate, they are the ones that put those numbers in, and you talk to the smart contract ultimately. Inside the block, there are two interesting functions. There's in the header, there's f of this, and f of this is really a hash function over the entire block. So it's a hash, produces a number, which is guaranteed to only represent that block, but it also has in it a link to the previous block. And this way you've got, if every block has a hash, it's a hash of hash of hash of hash of hashes. And that's called a Merkle chain. And that hashing function is where we start to look at how do you achieve consensus. Okay, so the basis of trust in a blockchain is entirely based upon this notion of consensus. And consensus is that 51% of the miners must agree to the outcome. If 49% don't agree, tough. That's not the truth. Truth is given by 51%. In order to rewrite history, as it were, you would have to own 51% of the miners, and you would have to reverse engineer all of the previous blocks because of the Merkle tree hash. This is why it's very expensive to do. You would actually need somewhere in the region of 75% of all the compute power that all the miners have on Bitcoin's blockchain in order to do that. And that's what prevents it. It's too expensive. Essentially, you've priced out those fraudulent actors by using an algorithm. And this algorithm, which uses this hash, what it does is all of the miners get the new block at the same time. And then those miners think about solving a problem, a cryptographic problem. And whilst I'm here, I'm just going to start something. So I'm just going to switch because I've actually got a demo of this. So this little thing in pink, I'm going to start it now. But what it's going to do is it's going to create a hash. I'm going to tell it to use as much processing as possible. That's what nice minus N20 means. It's giving it a high priority. And it's going to look for a hash that has 4 leading zeros. And when it finds one, that's the answer. And this is kind of what these miners have to do to sweat. Now I'm just going to start this and we'll come back to it in a minute. So that's running now. And it's a tiny algorithm. So those miners sweat and they find that answer. The first one to find it says, I've got the answer. And all the others have a look at the answer. And the answer has to be really quick to check. Whereas the problem has to be really hard to solve. So finding those zeros is a really hard problem. Might seem simple, but you literally have to start at 1 and keep counting a number, putting it into the hash until you get 4 leading zeros. That's how that works. And it's very, very time consuming. It will take about 7 or 8 minutes. So when the miners when one of them's come up with the answer, tells everyone else, and they say, yes, that's okay. And then the miner that solved it gets the reward. And the reward is the algorithmic issuance of Bitcoins. And every epoch, they halve that number. So it started out where the very beginning of time for Bitcoin, I think you get 64 Bitcoins for correctly mining a block. And that means that the flow of coins is managed algorithmically. There was a complete number of coins, about 21 million, that can be mined over all time. Once all 21 million have been mined, there's no more coins to mine. And you're halving the number of coins that you can receive over time as you go through each epoch. So it started off at 64. I think it's now down to 8 that you can earn. But obviously, Bitcoin is a listed coin. And that's not something that I would advocate, but I'll come back to that. So when they've done that, there's a real big problem with this because it's using a huge amount of energy. What it's actually doing is they're betting thermodynamics that they can reach the answer quicker than the next guy. So the bigger the computers, the faster they run, the more heat they generate, the more electricity they consume. That's what these guys, these miners, are betting. And it turns out that Bitcoin's blockchain consumes about the same energy every day as the island of Ireland. This is astounding. Now, even more astounding is that there's currently there's more than 2,200 cryptos now. But the last time I looked, when I did this slide, it was 2,200 cryptos, all with their own blockchains, all driven by this proof of work, this go and find the answer to the puzzle. They're not as big as Bitcoin yet, but if they were, there isn't actually enough electricity to power them if they all became as big as Bitcoin in the world. That isn't all. The other issue is it's very slow. So Bitcoin, apologies for the resolution on this, Bitcoin does about 7 transactions a second. Now, I worked in financial services many years ago, and I can tell you I wouldn't get out of bed for 7 transactions a second. Whereas Visa and others operated about 24,000 transactions a second. So there's a huge gap. If you imagine using a blockchain to do all the energy transactions, well, 7 per second wouldn't cut it over the entirety of the UK. We've got to be able to operate at much, much, much faster speeds. And the problem for Bitcoin is simply, and these proof of work blockchains, is the cryptographic mechanism for solving that little puzzle just takes time. It's not something that you can easily speed up. Okay. Now let's just check to see if it's finished. No, see, it's still going. We'll come back to it and I'll show you the answer. I'll check the answer to show you how quick that is. So we've got fundamentally 2 problems that we've got to deal with existing blockchain technology. We know that we can't use proof of work because it would burn the planet and it's too slow. So fortunately, when this was realized, the blockchain community tried to figure out what's a better way of doing consensus. And they realized that given that they were currently really betting thermodynamics on the consensus, why not just bet tokens? If you just bet tokens, literally proof of stake, so you put 1,000 tokens up saying, I've checked the block looks good to me, I've got 1,000 tokens that says it's okay. And if I'm wrong, I lose my 1,000. And if I'm right, I get a transaction fee. So I don't get tokens minted, I just get a transaction fee. I'll come back to why that becomes important presently. So if you do that, the energy consumption is way, way smaller, right? If you do this stake-based mechanism, it's way, way smaller. There's no cryptographic puzzle. So they tend to be about 1 million times less energy than a Bitcoin transaction. 1 million times. Now, they also get quicker because they don't really have to solve a cryptographic problem. So computationally, it's much faster. So a proof of stake blockchain will whilst it consumes 1/1,000,000th of the Bitcoin costs, it scales 1,000 times more. So you might get 7,000 transactions a second, but that's not enough either. There's still further work that would have to be done. But fortunately, there are some solutions out there in the blockchain world. Now, I want to just talk about scale, because scale becomes important in our ecosystem. So I wanted to sort of introduce this concept of scale. A scale was actually a drinking cup in the Middle Ages, and it was used to measure things. So scale's always about measurement. And in the IT world, a system's ability to scale is generally measured in transactions per second or gigabytes stored per transaction. And in a way that the performance is predictable to the observer. And that's how we consider scale. The scale that we're looking to model is the scale and actually the abundance of different types of energy assets that might reside in domestic premises, at hospitals, and potentially at factories. That's the scale of the challenge, is that if you imagine how many there are, and you have to suddenly manage them and tell them all to turn down, up, or give power, how do we do that right across the country? So that's what we mean by scale. So coming to an end of my quick tour of blockchain technology, fundamentally, the blockchain gives us trust and transparency. That's a key to blockchain technology. And and this is what the algorithmic consensus delivers. Right, so it gives us the trust that the data is correct, and a blockchain has transparency in terms of the wallets that get tokens, because that's how tokens get moved, and the trust that the data is true without a third party's involvement changes everything. And proof of stake is fairly more scalable than proof of work, so it has to be a proof of stake blockchain that we would use, and that changes a lot of things as well, because the tokenomics around a proof of work blockchain like Bitcoin is, as I said, simple. there's a certain number of tokens that can be created. The miners get their fixed payment for solving the cryptographic problem. And you can buy tokens, and that's it. So the tokenomics model's not that interesting. With proof of stake, there has to be an incentive over and above the transaction fees. So we have to consider other techniques to manage those token supplies. So you can kind of think of a proof of stake network, proof of stake blockchain, as having its own, totally its own economy. You might have applications on top of it that have aspects to that economy, and we'll look at a bit of that in a second. I'm just, before I go into the next one, I'll just check to see if it's finished. No, it's still not finished. So you can see that this solving the cryptographic problem really does take a lot of time. So trust is an economic and an algorithmic thing in a proof of stake blockchain. It's both computational, but it's also economic because you control the token flow. So you issue the tokens up front. So you can think of this as a lot of tokens that get used to do anything on the blockchain, including securing the blockchain by means of validators who bet tokens on the correctness of a block. So you've got to deal with the incentivization for people like that. It also has resource usage built in because a blockchain, a proof of stake blockchain, it operates by putting tokens in the slot, literally. If you have no tokens, you can't do anything. So the tokens are like putting a token in the slot and something happens. And that means that the resource costing, the use of the network, the use of computation, the CPU, the use of memory, all of that is counted within the blockchain itself. It does that automatically. Security is built in. And in the world of blockchain, in the world of our ecosystem, the DSOs, Scottish Powers, the Octopus Energies, and so on, these guys are all charged with securing the network. But because the security of the network in a blockchain world fundamentally relies on the validators validating the transactions, the more validators you have, the more secure the network is, because nobody can control the staking pool, which is part of the reason for doing it. So when you model the tokenomics, you have to account for that. You have to account for how many tokens out of my entire supply do I give over to securing the network, which forces you to think about the value of securing the network. And then it gives you an economic model around how you do that, how you compensate the validators for doing so. Identity is built in, so this notion of self-sovereignty becomes pretty easy, and ownership too. Cost accounting is built in, everything is token operated, and there's an interesting aspect where cryptographic signatures are built in, which can be used to attest to the truth. So if you're doing auditing and maintenance of your equipment, you can actually put the results onto the chain with cryptographic signatures that attest to that being the truth. So that means that you can speed up the notion of being fit for purpose because you passed the audit, and it's totally transparent. Anyone could see that your equipment is fine. So we can look at a blockchain in slightly different ways. So there's through the eyes of a token model. So there's a token model for the proof of stake itself, for validating. So every validator gets the block at the same time, just like the miners did. They validate the data in the block has not been tampered with, and it seems to be correct with respect to the previous block as well. And then rather than solve this cryptographic problem, it's put the money up and it says, yep, I'm done, I agree. And then the rewards, instead of going to one miner, it goes to the validators in proportion to the staking, as long as they're correct. So there's a whole token model for that, and there's a whole set of incentives, because within that token model for the proof of stake, you might have seniorage. So you want people to lock their tokens up for a period of maybe a year or 24 months. So think of it as an investment vehicle for which you're going to give them a percentage back. So maybe you set that percentage. So this becomes very much an economic model. On top of that, and that's all about securing the network. So on top of that, you have applications that use the blockchain that are putting data on that the proof of stake token model provides the security for. So those token models also have to have a degree of input from somebody that knows enough about value propositions and economics. And you might have several different ones. So these are the utilities that sit on top of the token model that's securing the blockchain. These are the utility models that might represent loyalty rewards or peer-to-peer energy exchange. So if you had a virtual power plant that was in your area, you could trade energy with your neighbor. If you had a battery that was fully charged and they needed some energy, they could come to you and you could discharge it and get paid for it using peer-to-peer exchange. And then there's demand side flexibility as envisaged currently by the grid and the DSOs. Right, so in this model, the DSOs, their new model would be to secure the network. So the DSOs would become validators in each area, and they might have more than one area that they cover. So they kickstart the network and would use the token models to get their money back. So in this way, they're guaranteed to get a profit. And this becomes fundamental to ensuring that the DSOs don't stop everything. You have to get their buy-in, and this is one of the challenges in any transformation. They're actually, at the end of the day, they will find the level that they need to be at in order to extract value, or they go out of business. So this is quite a challenge to them, this approach. So what's it got to do with you guys? Well, for every blockchain, every token model, there's some notion of payment, there's some notion of profit and distribution, there's some notion of membership, and there's some notion of governance. And each of those are being used to move tokens around. So payment, you're paying with tokens, you're buying tokens with fiat, you might be burning tokens, you might be funding your treasury with a certain number of tokens to make sure you can essentially make sure the network continues. There's fee sharing with the stakers as well as the application owners, loyalty offers, discounts, and governance is the security bit with the validators. And all of those have to have token models. And this is out with any of the technology. And the token models, if you think about it as a small economy, which has a base model for securing the world like a government has, and then models for different enterprises, which are the token models for the value propositions, you've kind of got a closed world here. And that's an opportunity for people that like to fiddle about with economics largely and figure out whether they can refine things. Because at the end of the day, the behavior that will provide the momentum for these tokens to move around will be what people do at the end of the day. And so given economics takes account of that, this becomes quite an important activity. And there's many blockchain projects out there that really require people to engage around the token model, because at the moment, it's by and large a lot of tech heads that do it who don't really know economics in the way that they should, which is why many projects have failed. And I'll come on to that right at the end. So for each token model, you've got all sorts of things that you might play with. Lockups to ensure that the tokens are in the right supply, being used for the right thing, locked up to do that. Seniorage, which is giving you an interest rate back for the money that you stake. The security utility token ratio, how many tokens do I use for network security for proof of stake versus how many tokens do I use for transaction fees? And then new token issuance. So there's a whole range of things that are applicable to each of the token models that you might start to model. And in closing, I thought I'd leave you with some advice. So it can be quite exciting in the blockchain world. But my personal experience is many projects listed tokens before they delivered value as a means to raise capital. when really the tokens should have been used for utility projects in the same way that you put a token in and something happens. So you get some energy or whatever that may be. My advice and guidance would be don't list tokens for utility projects. People will pressure you to list tokens because they think it's an easy way to raise money. But actually, the issue is if you do list your tokens on an open market, you're subject to speculation. And at that point, your tokens, you're not in charge of your own token value. It's much better to manage that token internally and to peg it to some fiat currency yourself and never list. And then you're connected to the real world by the tether you have with the fiat currency that you've decided to peg it to. And then develop your token models to distribute that value that gets created. Those token models become absolutely imperative. So I shall leave it there and see if there's any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, look,
we've
here we
got
go.
an answer.
One last thing. It came back. It took 13 minutes and 57 seconds. Right. Now I'm going to check it. Right. That's the green screen. And this is how fast that goes. Right. That was an instant. And you can see the 4 leading zeros. So it's easy for me to check the answer, very hard for me to find the answer. So it worked in the end.
Well, thank you, Steve. There's a lot to take in there from someone like me who doesn't know much about blockchain until this presentation. Before the questions, I'll just pass over to Judy, who will go through the schedule for this week and what you'll be working on in your groups. And then we can ask Steve whatever questions we've got for the presentations that we're maybe working on and the presentation that is just gone through.
Okay, let me just go back to the beginning, wouldn't it? Okay, so thanks very much, Steve. Yeah, it was really interesting. I don't know much about blockchain either, so it was good to understand a bit more. So
Thank you.
let's just talk briefly about what's happening the rest of this week and the question which we'd like you to have a look at. I'm not going to spend very long on the kind of mechanics of the week because you've all done these before. So we'll focus more on the questions. But just very briefly, you should all be aware that there's only one schedule this week. So actually everybody will be working together between 5 and 7 each evening over the next 3 evenings, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then the presentation session will be 5 o'clock UK time next Monday. If you need them, there's my contact details. Obviously, we'll catch up with one another each day anyway at 5 o'clock. And of course, as usual, you have your group space if you want to use it to work on your presentation. In terms of what we'd like you to have a look at, what we're asking you to do this time is each address the same question. So there aren't sort of 3 separate questions or anything for 3 different groups. This time we've just got one title asking you to pick an industry or organization and think about how emerging information technologies could be of use and how they can be used to move the business forward, thinking about that in strategic terms. So how can they actually support the strategic development of the organisation? What we would like you to do, though, is to take a specific new technology and a particular sector or organisation so that your presentation is based on a specific example and thinking about the benefits, cost, challenges, and so on to that particular sector or organization. You can base your presentation on a development in information technology of your choice. So it doesn't need to be blockchain. You might want to pick a different one, such as AI, or you might want to look at things like how smartphones could be used in a particular sector in a more strategic way. So think about what actually interests you as a group. But it's important that whatever you do is focused on the application of technology to your sector or organization, and thinking about how that technology can be harnessed to move the strategy of the organization forward. Just a few other reminders. You have all the normal site and so on for you to use if you want to. We'll have the 3 facilitated sessions Wednesday, Thursday and Friday at 5 o'clock in my Zoom room. And as usual, if you're slightly late, that's okay. But if you arrive after 15 minutes of the start time, you won't be given access to the session except under particular circumstances. So generally arrive within 15 minutes of the start time, otherwise you may well not be able to continue with the director's workshop. But you know that's the usual rule. Again, 15-minute presentation with 5 minutes allowed for questions before the next group, and everybody needs to take part, and I will be sharing the recording template and so on. So any questions then, either about the presentation that Steve has given us, or how you might tackle this particular question? Over to you, Luke.
Yeah, that's fine. Steve, I've got a question just regarding the industry or organization. Is there anything in kind of any examples that you can think of any businesses that would be good to look into?
Yes, it's funny you should say that. I was just thinking that. You look at the music industry and look at Spotify, and you know, you can watch the movie of Spotify, of course. It's on Netflix, right? If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's pretty true. But if you look at, I was involved in the music industry quite early on, before Spotify. So I had some knowledge of it because I was talking to Sony. At that time, a lot of the people that were producing DVDs, like Sony, were really worried about piracy. I remember walking across the London Bridge when I lived in West Sussex. I was walking to work across London Bridge, and there was always a guy with a duffel bag and a whole bunch of bootleg movies, selling them for £1, right? And they were flying out like hotcakes. And they were worried about piracy. I went to Sony and said, and pitched them, why don't you allow people to store movies at their home, on their home device, and charge them for the storage? But they didn't quite do it. And then along comes, a lot of people were playing around with digital stuff then. As you know, there were a lot of bootleg stuff out there, streamable, from the Pirate Bay to many others. And then along comes Spotify, right? And their bag was, let's make it all free. I mean, they're really not friendly to musicians because they wanted it all free and they didn't want to have to pay any royalties. But they finally gave in on the royalties front as they started to get well known. And they got well known because it was super quick to find any track. And the smoothness of the playing made it really quite compelling. People started wanting to, well, they didn't want to live without it, right? It was that sort of thing. It got them absolutely addicted on it. And by the time Spotify started to think more seriously about how they should make their money, because they weren't making any at that point, they they started to look at paywalls. They started to look at advertising, and then pretty soon they started to look at how they ran the contracts for the artists, basically how they transformed the music industry. What they've become is a huge, almost a monopoly, but not quite. They have a disproportionate amount of power over how the money is dispersed from the playing of those tracks, which is why a lot of artists, are not particularly happy about them. But when you look at that growth, that technological enablement, and the growth based upon the business decisions they made, the technology enabled it, but it was the business decisions they made. That is a great case study. You can pull, I did it myself, you can pull their accounts and have a look at how much do they get from advertising, how much goes out the door to the musicians, and how many staff do they have. It's quite an instructive journey to look at Spotify.
Brilliant. No, yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that as you've got your Netflix, you've got all your streaming devices now as well, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, Netflix and Apple were vying. I remember sitting next to the CTO of Netflix many years ago when they were tiny, and they were concentrating on largely TV series as opposed to films, because they were competing head on with Sony. And Steve Jobs at that time had negotiated all the deals with not Sony, with Apple. He'd negotiated the deal with Sony and stuff like that. So he suddenly got this wealth of material that they could sell through iTunes, including the movies. And Netflix chose a different model. They decided to go for subscription versus pay for the movie. Right, so theirs was a subscription. It wasn't rental; it was pure subscription, and that kept them in the game because they had TV series. You were desperate to subscribe so you could watch the TV series. And that kind of was how they segmented their challenge to Apple. I mean, now when you look at it, they have so much money that they're able to produce and influence what films get made. One of the little tiny things that they did, which was quite fundamental, we all take it for granted, but it was the way in which they did it, the way in which they delivered the software and managed how the software features appeared on your Netflix, because not everybody got the same. When they tested the replay, when you play a film and you stop it and you're on your phone and you get home, you get in and you put your TV on, you go back to Netflix, you pick up the same film and it starts from exactly where you left off. Doesn't matter which device. That was one of those features that they put out there, tested it, people loved it, and it resulted in a large swell in the membership that you could do that, because suddenly they gave you a smooth experience over multiple devices. And that was a small piece of that. There wasn't any interesting technology there. What there was a profound understanding of the value proposition that really gelled with users, which was, I'm going to watch this in every conceivable location across my journey today, and I don't want to lose where I was.
Brilliant. Does anybody have any questions? I have one just regarding blockchain. Because do you have any examples of? I mean, you were discussing before how it's with the way they do the checks, and the human error is still, there's still a possibility of human error within blockchain. Has there been any kind of big mishaps that's been with blockchain? I mean, I'm guessing there has, but has there been any?
Yeah.
Examples?
I mean, there were two. I can tell you two specific mishaps. And this is to do with I mean, I'm a professor of distributed computing, so I'm a maths geek at heart. So this is about proving that something is correct as opposed to testing that something's correct. So Ethereum, I think, were doing stuff in the earlier days, and they thought that they'd proved that the transactions were properly serialized. So, somebody adds something to an account, followed by somebody adding something to another account, followed by, it's always followed by, so it's serialized. And so you couldn't tread one on top of the other. So it wasn't like somebody would rewrite the number, and then somebody did. And
Wow, okay.
the net result was $100 million loss. They had to at some point stop the chain, had to bring the chain down, and sort of hard boot it from a point in time before the bug occurred. They literally have to roll everything back. That cost them a fortune. And then there was another one where, in the days of NFTs, if any of you remember NFTs, these weird blockchain things that they live on a blockchain, and there's only supposed to be one of them, a digital photograph, for instance. So somebody decided to sell as an NFT an album. They sold it as an NFT. Somebody purchased it for quite a lot of money, about $11 million. But the blockchain wasn't able to scale in terms of what it could store. So what they stored was a reference to where the music was. The music was stored in the equivalent of a Google Drive. Right? Now, on a blockchain, you can't go and delete something, but on your Google Drive, you can. So somebody deleted it. The person that owned it clicked on the link, and what did they get? They got 404, resource not found. So, those things were blockchain 1.0 to 2.0. Blockchain 3.0, there's been a lot more academic involvement to ensuring that those silly mistakes can't happen and that you can store anything. So now you can. Now it's a case of those blockchains starting to appear. Perhaps in the future, what we'll see in the near-term future, we'll start to see some applications out there, and instead of it saying powered by Intel, it will say powered by whatever the name of the blockchain is. They're coming, but the challenge has been, as I said, the minute that you choose to list your token, everyone's eyes and attention turns to speculation, and that pretty much destroys the companies. And that's because the technologists that invented these coins, that created these new coins and created projects around them, were convinced that they could just create coins like you print money, and eventually the market catches you.
Yeah.
And it did. And that the perturbations in the market of crypto value meant that the valuation of many companies wildly went up and down, to the point where it destabilized the entire functioning of their own limited treasury. And that's what caused a lot of them to fail.
Does anyone have any other questions? Did you manage to get in on Bitcoin? Did you manage to invest in any of these cryptocurrencies?
No, I don't speculate. So no, I would never do it.
Yeah.
I'd never do it. So no, I think somebody had a question, but no, I never speculated at all, and I was very much against in one of the blockchain projects that we ever listed. And seeing what I saw happen, not just to that company but to others, I think it confuses things. That blockchain is not cryptocurrency. You're a cryptocurrency when you list. Otherwise, you're just a token. You're a means of counting value. That's it. And we use money for that normally. Well, this just changes it. You just substitute the money for the tokens, all of the cost accounting, everything's there. So all of the management of the token movement and the flow, which is the money, the value moving, can all be done using the tokens. And then you turn it into fiat at the edges. Really, all you're doing is more efficient accounting in a decentralized world without intermediaries.
Zari, I believe you had a question.
Yes, thanks, Luke. Thanks, Steve, for the wonderful presentation. Even though I'm very new to this, just a quick question. Even though this technology, blockchain, one of the USPs is the trust and transparency, what you said. But how do you see the adoption? Is it as expected, or the adoption is what I'm saying is
Challenging.
challenging? Exactly, the
It
challenging
is
because of
challenging.
yes, is it because
So
of the
it's,
understanding problem, or is the energy
I
issue?
think that there's two fundamental challenges to the adoption of blockchain. One is, how easy is it to use? Right. So if it's as easy as Dropbox, right, I can drag and drop
Right.
files, right, then that's easy enough. But most aren't. They can't mimic a file system, despite the fact they're storing stuff. They store it in a flat way that doesn't have a namespace, like the namespace of URLs. However, there are a few proof of stake blockchains that do have that. And that means they can be mounted on your computer as if they were like Dropbox. It's just that you can't delete things. The minute you do that, you change the ubiquitousness or potential ubiquitousness. So that's one of the challenges. And I think the other challenge, is largely they have not had this ability to store anything. So it's the other side of the namespace. If you have a namespace, the likelihood is you'll want to store digital assets of arbitrary size. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could store a film on a blockchain forevermore? A secure, forevermore immutable record of, my family's upbringing, for example. I might want that, but many blockchains don't provide either the addressability using a namespace, nor do they provide the ability to store. Well, they provide the ability. I mean, if you wanted to store a megabyte on Ethereum, I think it's going to cost you about $1,000. That's because the price of Ether, because it's a listed token. If they'd pegged it, it might be 30 cents. So I think this issue of the confusion between cryptocurrency and how dodgy that seems to many versus blockchain itself is possibly the other challenge. Actually, there is a third challenge. The third challenge is, how do you get executives in businesses to imagine decentralization? Most businesses are based on centralization, not on decentralization.
Absolutely.
So that's probably the biggest transformational change in somebody's head that you have to make. So in the case of the ecosystem I'm in, to illustrate that point, I think it's particularly pertinent for the challenge that's before you all. You've got these DSOs. They don't really want to give up their turf, right? They don't really want to give up their turf, but they're incapable of managing assets at a domestic level. They can manage a big wind farm, they can manage power plants, buying electricity, they can manage that, but they can't manage my home. They can't manage my assets, right? They simply are not set up to be able to do that. So this is where decentralization starts to win, because you could manage that in a decentralized way. But the minute you do that, the minute that you decentralize that, particularly if you have that self-sovereign ownership of your energy assets, you start to question, well, what is the role of the DSO? All of my cost accounting is being done by the blockchain. So they're not providing value in that. That's done by the blockchain. I'm able to put energy onto my segment of the network, and somebody else can take that energy off. As long as it doesn't leave my zone, then I'm not impinging on the grid. It's only when you go across zones, across substations, basically, that you impinge on the uses of the grid itself to balance through those zones, through the substations. So as long as you can trade within your substation, then, why shouldn't you? But if you did that, the DSOs never get paid.
Yep.
So if you do that, they're going to say, we don't want this. So we had to come up with a way of showing them that no, there still is a vital role for you to play as a DSO, right? They could potentially do something in terms of providing a marketplace for the peer-to-peer trading and perhaps earn some rewards that way. But more importantly, their role in securing the network, it matches completely the security you get from being validators on the network. So if the DSOs invest in a series of validator nodes, they don't have to have one, they can have 12 validator nodes for Bodmin in Cornwall substation, right? So they have 12 validator nodes that will run the network. And maybe I decide I want one too as an individual. So I can have a validator. I can share in the rewards of managing the network. Because when you consider the payment, so if I get paid for supplying or reducing my demand, either way, right, it results in a change in the electrical field in the substation because I'm either not consuming or I'm providing. And that's how power plants work. That's how the grid works.
Sure.
And the money that we get paid on the blockchain is simply reflecting what happened electrically. That's all it's doing, really. And then everything else on top is value services. So you charge a premium on top, and the validators, for every transaction, the validators get paid some reward based upon their stake. So what I would do in a substation to decentralize it is point out to the DSOs, look, you have a role to play, and this is a role you can play. But in terms of being validators, you're not allowed to have more than 49% of the validator pool. Because if they don't have 49%, you can't say they own it. So if they own 49% and the community owns 51%, it becomes a decentralized self-sovereign play. And this is where the economics comes in with the tokenomics, because it takes somebody that understands tokenomics to understand, don't give the validator, don't give all the DSOs more than 51% of the stake, more than 49% of the stake.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Steve.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Any more questions?
Okay, I'd leave you with one other thought. So in the same way that Spotify is a good story, it's worth going in history and looking at, in the 1980s, what happened to Smith Corona. Right? This is the anti-pattern to success. So have a look at Smith Corona and see what happened to them in the last 3 years of their life as a company. It's the decisions they didn't take. And if I get to talk to you all again, you can tell me what you found out about Smith Corona.
Thanks, Anna. Perfect. Well, if that's the case, we'll end the recording.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.